I have spent 30 years in uniform analyzing infrastructure warfare and strategic coercion campaigns across three theaters of conflict. I have watched the Soviets encircle Berlin, studied NATO interdiction doctrine in the Balkans, and briefed Pentagon leadership on critical infrastructure vulnerability assessments after the Iraqi Freedom Campaign. Nothing in those decades prepared me for what arrived across Ukrainian airspace in the 72 hours between February 9th and February 12th, 2026. Between 0340 and 0615 local time on February 10th, Russian forces launched approximately 240 cruise missiles and 180 Iranian-manufactured Shahed 136 loitering munitions in coordinated waves targeting 11 primary electrical substations, 4 regional switching hubs, and 23 transformer yards across 14 Ukrainian oblasts. Within 6 hours, the Ukrainian national grid operator Ukrenergo reported that installed generation capacity had dropped from 2 gigawatts to 1 gigawatts. 15 million civilians, roughly 40% of Ukraine's remaining population, lost electrical power. Ambient temperatures across Kyiv, Kharkiv, Lviv, and Dnipro were recorded between -8 and -14 Celsius. And Washington issued a statement calling the strikes unacceptable escalation while offering no immediate material response. I want to be honest with you about something. When I first reviewed the satellite imagery and the operational after-action summaries that crossed my desk from sources still inside the intelligence community, my immediate reaction was professional respect for the level of targeting precision and doctrinal discipline the Russian General Staff demonstrated in this operation. This was not random punishment. This was not indiscriminate terror bombing. This was calculated infrastructure degradation designed to achieve 3 simultaneous strategic effects: collapse civilian morale, severe NATO resupply logistics, and force Kyiv into negotiation from a position of infrastructural collapse. I know the human cost. I know there are families in Lviv right now burning furniture to stay warm, hospitals in Kharkiv operating on backup generators with fuel reserves measured in days, not weeks. This is not abstraction. This is deliberate strategic cruelty executed with military professionalism. In the next 38 minutes, I am going to walk you through 4 questions that every serious observer of this conflict needs answered. First, how did Russian targeting doctrine achieve simultaneous effects across a grid designed with Soviet-era redundancy specifically to survive this kind of strike? Second, what specific weapons systems and operational sequencing allowed Moscow to overcome Ukrainian air defense networks that have been reinforced with billions of dollars in Western interceptor technology? Third, why has NATO resupply capacity into Western Ukraine collapsed by an estimated 60 to 70% in the 14 days following this strike? And what does that arithmetic mean for Zelensky's ability to sustain frontline operations past April? Fourth, what is the broader strategic signal Moscow is sending to Beijing, to the Gulf states, to the developing world about the limits of Western security guarantees when infrastructure warfare reaches industrial scale? If this is the kind of analysis you have been looking for, the kind that does not soften or manage or sanitize what is actually happening on the ground, subscribe and stay with me. Hit like, drop your assessment in the comments section below. I read every single one. Let me be precise about this. The strike was executed in 4 distinct operational phases, each designed to exploit a specific vulnerability in Ukrainian grid architecture that Western planners either misunderstood or chose to ignore. Phase 1 began at 0340 local time when Russian Tu-95MS strategic bombers operating from Engels Air Base launched 72 Kh-101 cruise missiles in a southern vector targeting the Zaporizhzhia switching hub and the Dnipro regional substation cluster. The KH-101 is a subsonic, low observable cruise missile with a reported circular error probable of 6 to 8 meters and a 400-kilogram high-explosive penetrator warhead specifically designed for hardened infrastructure targets. Ukrainian air defense intercepted 14 of the 72 inbound missiles. 58 reached their targets. The Zaporizhzhia hub, which routes power from the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to eastern and southern oblasts, went offline at 0407. The Dnipro substation network, which handles distribution for a city of nearly 1 million people, lost function at 0421. That is a 76% penetration rate against a grid node defended by NASAMS and Patriot batteries. Phase 2 commenced at 0445 when a second wave of 80 caliber cruise missiles launched from Russian naval assets in the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea targeted the Western Resupply corridor. The primary targets were the Lviv transformer yards, the Rivne switching station, and the electrical substations serving the Polish border crossings at Yahodin, Ravaruska, and Shehini. Every single one of those crossings is a NATO resupply artery. Every single one requires electrical power to operate rail switching infrastructure, refrigerated pharmaceutical storage for medical resupply, and the automated logistics management systems that coordinate the flow of artillery ammunition, replacement vehicles, and spare parts into the Ukrainian interior. 41 caliber missiles reached their targets. Lviv lost power at 0518. The Rivne station went offline at 0532. The Polish border crossings lost grid connectivity within 90 minutes. NATO convoys stacked up for 17 kilometers on the Polish side of the frontier because Ukrainian rail systems could not function without electrical switching. Phase 3 was the saturation layer. Between 0515 and 0615, Russian forces launched 180 Shahed 136 loitering munitions, Iranian-designed one-way attack drones with a 40-kilogram warhead and a reported unit cost of approximately $20,000. These were not precision strikes. These were volume fires designed to overwhelm Ukrainian air defense and target secondary transformer yards, municipal substations, and backup generation facilities. Ukrainian mobile air defense teams, already depleted by 2 years of attritional warfare, intercepted an estimated 60 to 70 Shaheds. That means 110 to 120 reached their targets. That means substations in Chernihiv, Sumy, Poltava, Kirovohrad, Vinnytsia, Zhytomyr, and Cherkasy all lost function in the same 60-minute window. The grid did not degrade gracefully. It collapsed in a cascading failure because redundancy pathways were severed simultaneously across multiple oblasts. Phase 4 was the finishing sequence. At 0605, Russian forces launched a final wave of 40 Kh-22 supersonic anti-ship missiles repurposed for ground strike against the remaining high-voltage transformer yards in Kyiv and Kharkiv. The Kh-22 is a Cold War-era weapon, Mach 4 capable, with a reported circular error probable of 200 meters, which means it is not a precision instrument. But when you are targeting a transformer yard the size of a football field, precision becomes irrelevant. Kyiv lost its last operational substation at 0614. Kharkiv went dark at 0618. By 0630 local time, 15 million Ukrainians had no electrical power, no heating, no water pressure in municipal systems, no cellular network, and no ability to recharge devices that provide access to emergency information. I want you to understand what that means. This was not a tactical strike. This was not battlefield interdiction. This was industrial-scale infrastructure warfare executed with the kind of operational sequencing and targeting discipline that NATO war colleges teach as best practice. The Russian General Staff identified the critical nodes, calculated the redundancy pathways, allocated the weapon systems necessary to achieve simultaneous effects, and executed a 72-hour campaign that collapsed Ukraine's ability to function as a modern state. And they did it with weapons that cost, on average, 1/10 the price of the Western interceptors Ukraine expended trying to stop them. Let me tell you something. The narrative you are hearing from Western capitals right now is that Ukraine's air defense performed admirably, that intercept rates were high, that the grid will be restored in weeks. I have sat in those rooms. I know how Washington manages expectations. The intercept rate was approximately 35%. That is a failing grade in any air defense assessment. The grid will not be restored in weeks because Ukraine no longer has the industrial capacity to manufacture replacement transformers, and the Western supply chain for high-voltage electrical infrastructure is measured in months, not days. Kyiv is burning through its strategic fuel reserves to power backup generators in hospitals and command and control facilities. Those reserves were calculated to last 90 days in a static defensive posture. They are now being consumed at triple the planned rate because the entire civilian economy is competing for the same diesel fuel the military needs to operate its logistics tail. Here is what the Pentagon is not saying. NATO resupply into Ukraine has collapsed by an estimated 60 to 70% since February 12th. The Polish border crossings that handled 11,000 metric tons of ammunition, vehicles, and spare parts per week before the strikes are now handling fewer than 4,000 metric tons per week because rail switching systems are offline, because refrigerated storage for medical supplies has failed, because the automated logistics software that coordinates convoy movement requires electrical power and cellular data connectivity that no longer exists in the border zone. I am not speculating. I am reading the operational assessments that are circulating inside NATO Logistics Command. Ukrainian artillery rates of fire have dropped by 40% in the 2 weeks following the grid strikes. Not because Ukrainian gunners lack the will to fight, not because they lack the training, because the ammunition is not reaching the front line. The 155 millimeter artillery shells that Washington promised are stacking up in Polish warehouses because the rail network that moves them east is offline. The replacement barrels for M777 howitzers that are arriving from American depots are sitting in Lviv because the trucks that move them forward have no fuel, because the refineries that produce diesel require electrical power to operate. Stay with me because what comes next is what matters. The human cost is mounting in ways that do not appear in the daily briefing summaries. In Kharkiv, hospitals are operating on generator power with fuel reserves estimated at 12 to 16 days. Dialysis patients are being prioritized. Cancer treatment schedules are being yen. Surgeries are being postponed unless they are immediately life-threatening. In Kyiv, municipal water pressure has dropped to the point where apartment buildings above the 4th floor have no running water. Families are carrying water in plastic containers up stairwells in buildings where the elevators no longer function because there is no power. In Lviv, schools have been closed for 2 weeks. Children are staying home in unheated apartments because the municipal heating systems, which in Soviet-designed cities are centralized and electrically controlled, no longer function. The Ukrainian government is rationing electricity for 4 hours per day in rotating blackouts, but that 4-hour window is not enough to restore normalcy. It is enough to charge a phone, boil water, and prepare one hot meal. It is not enough to run a functioning economy. And here is the forbidden truth. Zelensky is desperate. On February 18th, he made an unannounced trip to Warsaw to meet with Polish leadership and reportedly requested an emergency injection of 5,000 portable generators, 200,000 tons of diesel fuel, and fast-tracked access to European electrical equipment stockpiles. The meeting lasted 4 hours. No joint statement was issued. Polish sources who spoke on background described the meeting as, and I am quoting a senior Polish defense official here, the most difficult conversation we have had with Kyiv since the invasion began. The implication was clear. Zelensky was asking for resources that Poland cannot provide in the necessary volume on the necessary timeline without compromising its own strategic reserves. And even if Poland could provide them, the delivery infrastructure into Ukraine no longer exists at scale. I have said for years in testimony, in private briefings, in conversations with serving officers who are now watching this channel, that NATO's entire Ukraine strategy rested on a single unstated assumption. The assumption was that Russia would never execute industrial-scale infrastructure strikes because the political cost inside Ukraine and the diplomatic cost in the West would be prohibitive. That assumption was wrong. Moscow calculated that the West's appetite for escalation has limits, that the Russian domestic population would tolerate infrastructure strikes framed as military necessity, and that Ukraine's ability to sustain resistance depends more on logistics than on morale. February 10th was the operational proof of that calculation. Before we go further, you need to understand the broader strategic context. What happened in the 72 hours between February 9th and February 12th is not a Ukrainian story. It is a global story about the limits of American security guarantees, the vulnerability of European energy and logistics infrastructure, and the willingness of Moscow to use coercive tools that Washington is either unable or unwilling to counter. In Moscow, this operation is being framed as a demonstration of Russian operational discipline and strategic patience. The Kremlin narrative is straightforward. For 2 years, NATO poured tens of billions of dollars into Ukrainian air defense. Patriot batteries, NASAM systems, IRIS-T launchers, AMRAAM interceptors costing $3 million per shot. And in a 72-hour window, the Russian military rendered that entire investment functionally irrelevant by executing a combined arms infrastructure campaign that Ukrainian air defense could not stop. The message to Beijing, to Tehran, to Pyongyang, to every capital watching this conflict is that Western military technology can be overwhelmed by volume, by doctrinal creativity, and by adversaries willing to tolerate reputational cost in exchange for operational effect. In Beijing, Chinese strategic analysts are studying this operation with the same intensity that American planners studied Desert Storm in 1991. They are asking whether the lessons of Ukraine's grid collapse apply to Taiwan's energy infrastructure, whether American interceptor stockpiles are sufficient to defend critical nodes in a high-intensity conflict, whether Washington's extended deterrence commitments remain credible when the cost of honoring them includes rolling blackouts in allied capitals. I want to be direct about something. The Chinese Communist Party is not sentimental. It does not make decisions based on ideology or emotional attachment. It makes decisions based on operational arithmetic, and the arithmetic coming out of Ukraine says that infrastructure warfare works, that Western air defense is finite, and that the political will to sustain long-term logistics support collapses when civilian populations lose heating in winter. For the Gulf states, this is a reputational watershed. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait have spent the last decade recalibrating their security relationships based on the assumption that American military primacy remains durable and that Washington will defend its allies when core interests are threatened. Ukraine was supposed to be the proof of that commitment. The narrative was that NATO would stand with Kyiv, that Western weapons would prevail, that Russian aggression would be punished and contained. February 10th shattered that narrative. What the Gulf monarchies saw was a Russian military executing industrial-scale strikes against a country that the United States has publicly committed to defend, and Washington's response was a statement calling it unacceptable. Not a military counterstrike, not an escalation of aid, a statement That is the strategic verdict that will echo across the Middle East for the next decade. For the broader developing world, this is a validation of the multipolar argument that Russia and China have been advancing for years. The narrative is that the unipolar moment is over, that American guarantees are not universal, that sovereignty and security in the 21st century will depend on self-reliance and on alignment with powers willing to use force without apology. Ukraine is being positioned in Russian and Chinese media not as a victim of aggression, but as a cautionary tale about the cost of dependence on Western security architecture. And that message is landing in capitals from Jakarta to Nairobi to Buenos Aires, where governments are quietly reassessing their alignment choices based on what they watched happen to a country that trusted NATO's commitment. I want to come back to a point I made earlier. The economic arithmetic of this operation is as strategically significant as the operational result. The Russian strike package, 240 cruise missiles, 180 Shahed drones, 40 Kh-22 missiles, cost an estimated $220 to $280 million to produce and deliver. Ukraine expended approximately $2 billion in interceptor missiles trying to stop them. The infrastructure damage, the replacement cost for transformers, substations, switching hubs, the economic cost of 2 weeks without power in a country still trying to function as a modern state is estimated by Ukrainian officials at somewhere between $8 and $12 billion. That is a return on investment measured at 40 to 1 in favor of the attacker. That arithmetic does not favor the defender. It does not favor NATO. It does not favor the long-term sustainability of Ukraine's resistance. And here is what honest analysis requires us to acknowledge. Russia has more missiles. Russia has more drones. Russia has more industrial capacity to sustain this kind of campaign than Ukraine has interceptors or transformers or Western political will to replace them. This is not defeatism. This is mathematical reality. If Moscow executes another wave of strikes in March and another in April and another in May, each one degrading Ukraine's infrastructure by another 10 to 15%, there is no resupply pathway, no Western aid package, no NATO commitment that restores what is being systematically destroyed. The grid can be rebuilt, but it cannot be rebuilt faster than Russia can destroy it, and it cannot be rebuilt while the war continues. The question I want to leave you with is this: does NATO have any remaining option that restores Ukrainian logistics capacity, stabilizes the electrical grid, and sustains Zelensky's ability to fight past the summer of 2026 without direct military intervention that risks escalation into a broader war? Or are we watching the final phase of a conflict whose outcome was determined not on the battlefield, but in the infrastructure war that the West chose not to prepare for? Leave your assessment in the comments. I read everyone. If this analysis delivered the kind of unfiltered strategic breakdown you have been looking for, share it, hit like, subscribe. The next update is already in preparation. I will see you in the next one.